My name is Grayson McQuaid, and I'm 81 years old. I was born during the final days of the Great Depression and raised through the war years when rationing was a reality and neighbors still left their doors unlocked. For most of my life, I lived in the same house on the outskirts of Sacramento, a modest one-story built in the 1950s, with linoleum in the kitchen, a creaky wooden porch out front, and the scent of honeysuckle always drifting in through the cracked windows during springtime. That house was never grand, but it was mine. Mine and Nancy's. My wife. We lived there for over 50 years. She passed away 8 years ago, just after her 74th birthday, and I haven't really lived since. The silence in that house is deafening now. I used to joke that she could talk the ears off a statue, and now I'd give anything to hear that voice echo off the kitchen walls one more time. The days since her death have blurred into one another. Coffee in the morning, toast with too much butter, local news on low volume because the TV hurts my ears now. I shuffle from room to room, pretending to straighten things that haven't moved in years. Sometimes I sit at the edge of the bed and press my face into her old housecoat, the one she used to wear when she gardened, because it still smells faintly of her skin, even after all this time. My son, Clayton, lives just 30 minutes away, but in the past year I've seen him fewer times than I've had dental cleanings. He used to bring the grandkids over when they were small, Eli and Katie, full of questions and always tugging at my sleeves. But they've grown into teenagers now, buried in their phones, and if I'm lucky, I get a thumbs-up emoji on my birthday. Clayton's wife, Janine, never liked me. She was always polite, but I saw how she looked at me across the dinner table, like I was some stubborn relic, a story from a chapter she'd rather skip. It got worse after Nancy died. They said I was isolating myself, that I wasn't taking care of my health, and maybe that was true. I didn't go out much. My knees hurt, my hearing's gone in one ear, and my balance isn't what it used to be. I had a small fall in the garage last winter. Didn't tell anyone. Laid there for an hour staring at the spider webs in the corner of the ceiling before I could sit up. But I was fine. No broken bones. Still, the walls felt smaller after that. I started to dread the nights most of all. The house grew cold, colder than it used to, and I started turning the thermostat higher just to feel something. Then came the conversation. Clayton called and said he and Janine had been thinking. Dangerous words I should have known. They said they were worried about me, that the house was too much to manage alone, that maybe I should consider selling it and moving in with them for a while, just until we figure things out. I asked if there was room, and Clayton said, well, not in the house exactly, but we've got the shed out back. It's finished. It's got power and insulation. We'll put a space heater in there, and you can have privacy. I laughed. I thought it was a joke. It wasn't. Janine even texted me photos of the shed. A 12-by-12 unit with a fold-out cot and a nightstand that still had gardening tools stacked against it. I didn't want to go, but I was tired. Tired of the quiet, of making tea and drinking it alone, of forgetting why I walked into the living room and pretending I remembered. So I said yes. I told myself I'd treat it like a little adventure, something temporary. I sold the house. A young couple with a baby on the way bought it. Said they loved the vintage charm. I packed up my clothes, some photos of Nancy, a few books, and my war medals that no one's ever asked me about, and I left behind the place where I had lived more than 6 decades. It felt like leaving my own skin. Clayton helped me move, but he didn't say much during the drive, just fiddled with the radio and hummed along to country songs he knew I hated. When we pulled into his driveway, I looked at the house I'd visited a dozen times over the years. It looked the same as I remembered. Pristine lawn, white trim, 2 stories, an American flag above the garage. But my destination was not the house. It was the shed tucked behind the garden. I stepped inside and was hit with the smell of mildew and varnish. They had swept it, yes, and moved in a lamp and an old dresser, but it was still a shed. There was one window, high up, letting in a shaft of light. The walls were unpainted plywood. The floor creaked. There was a small rug, but it didn't cover the cold. They'd left a portable heater humming in the corner. Janine called it rustic. I nodded and said thank you. What else could I do? I was too old to start over, too old to argue. That night, lying on the cot with a single thin blanket, I stared at the ceiling and wondered if this was it. If I'd lived all those years, worked 2 jobs to put my son through college, taken care of Nancy through chemo, and buried my own brother without complaint, just to end up in a glorified tool shack behind someone else's house. There's a certain kind of silence that only comes when you realize you've become invisible. It doesn't make a sound. It just settles in your bones and stays there. I tried to make the best of it. I cleaned the place, arranged my books on the makeshift shelf, even set up my old transistor radio on the windowsill. Every morning I shuffled across the backyard to the main house for coffee. Sometimes Janine would let me inside, sometimes she'd pass it to me on the porch. Clayton left early for work and came home late. The kids were always busy. I offered to help around the house, mow the lawn, fix the squeaky gate, clean the gutters. Janine smiled tightly and said, "Just rest, Grayson. You've earned it." But rest without purpose isn't rest. It's a slow death. I started taking long walks around the neighborhood, even though my knees complained the whole time. I needed to remember what the sky looked like without the filter of that tiny shed window. Sometimes I'd sit on the curb for 20 minutes, just watching squirrels chase each other or the mailman do his route. It was the closest I came to company. Weeks passed. Then months. Winter crept in. And even with 2 heaters and blankets, the shed became a freezer at night. One morning I woke to find frost on the inside of the glass. I knocked on the back door of the house, hoping maybe I could take a hot shower. Janine answered, half-dressed for yoga, and said, "The kids are getting ready for school. Can you wait an hour?" I said, "Sure." I didn't wait. I walked to the community center instead. They had bathrooms. They also had a bulletin board. And on that board was a flyer. Know Your Rights, Elder Law and Property Ownership Seminar. Free. I took one. I don't know why. Maybe I just wanted to sit in a room where someone would look at me and say, "You matter." That flyer would change everything. But back then I had no idea. I was just an old man in a shed, trying to feel less forgotten, and still telling myself that maybe, if I was patient enough, someone might remember I was once the head of a household, once a father, once a husband, once somebody. The morning I realized something had shifted irreversibly wasn't particularly special. The sun was weak, barely casting light through the grey clouds that hovered low over Sacramento like a heavy curtain. I woke up stiff from another restless night in the shed, my back aching from the cheap cot mattress that had developed a dip in the middle where my body always seemed to sink. The heater had shut off at some point during the night, and I could see my breath as I sat up. My hands were shaking slightly, not just from the cold, but from something deeper, something that had been growing in me quietly, like a weed in the dark. I pulled on my wool sweater, the one Nancy had knitted for me 20 years ago, now thinned at the elbows and frayed at the collar. It still smelled faintly of cedar and memory. I stepped outside and paused, listening for the familiar rustle of the family stirring inside the main house. But the windows were dark, no sign of movement. I checked my watch, 6:47. Too early, perhaps. Still, I walked up to the porch and knocked. No answer. I knocked again, waited. Finally, Janine opened the door a crack, her hair wrapped in a towel, irritation already in her eyes. "Grayson, it's early," she said flatly, as if I had burst into her bedroom unannounced. I apologized, said I was just hoping for some hot coffee, maybe to warm up inside for a bit. She sighed and told me to wait on the porch. 5 minutes later, she came back with a travel mug and a frozen smile. "Here you go," she said, closing the door before I could respond. I stood there for a moment, staring at the closed door, then turned and walked slowly back to the shed. The coffee was lukewarm and too sweet. That day, something in me began to calcify. It wasn't anger yet, but it was the early formation of it, the sediment of humiliation collecting over months. Later that afternoon, as I sat with a blanket wrapped around my shoulders, trying to read through the fogged lenses of my glasses, I heard voices outside. Not the usual din of the kids or the barking of the neighbor's dog, but measured, intentional voices. I peeked through the small side window of the shed and saw Clayton standing near the back patio, talking to a woman in a tailored blazer and holding a folder. She had a clipboard in hand and was pointing toward the backyard, toward where I sat. At first I thought it was a contractor. Maybe they were finally planning to fix up the shed, add insulation or a better heater. But then she said something that stopped my breath. "If you're planning to list the house in spring, we should get photos soon. The market's strong right now, and the backyard is great square footage." I backed away from the window, my heart thudding. List the house? What house? Their house? But why would they need the backyard photos? Unless... No. I sat down slowly on the cot, trying to make sense of what I had heard. It wasn't until dinner, when I was invited inside, rare as that was, that the truth began to unspool itself. Clayton was uncharacteristically cheerful, Janine oddly cordial. They'd made a casserole, served me a plate without the usual comments about salt or sugar. We made small talk about weather and traffic. I waited, knowing something was coming. And then, just as I finished the last bite of food, Clayton leaned back and said, "Dad, we've been talking about the future. Long term, you know?" I nodded slowly. "The thing is, this setup, it's temporary. And we think it's best, for all of us, if we start looking into more sustainable options. Maybe a facility. There's one just 20 minutes away with a beautiful rec room and nurses on call. You'd have privacy, a warm bed, activities with folks your age." I stared at him, chewing the inside of my cheek to keep from speaking too quickly. "You mean a nursing home?" Janine winced. "That's such an outdated word. It's assisted living. It's dignified." I set my fork down. "And what happens to me until then?" They exchanged a glance. "We'll keep you in the shed until something opens up. We're on a waiting list." I didn't ask how long the wait was. I didn't ask why I hadn't been consulted. Instead, I stood, quietly thanked them for the meal, and walked back outside, my breath visible in the cold night air. The next day, I found myself staring at the flyer I'd picked up at the community center weeks earlier. Know your rights, elder law, and property ownership. I almost threw it away then, telling myself I was being paranoid. But something about the realtor's voice, about the way she'd gestured toward my shed as part of their square footage, gnawed at me. I took a city bus to the address listed on the flyer. The law office was tucked between a laundromat and a payday loan store, unimpressive from the outside. But inside, I met a woman named Cynthia Herrera, a lawyer with kind eyes and a sharp tongue. I told her everything, how I'd signed over my old house to Clayton because he said it would help with taxes and medical insurance, how I was living in the shed, how I'd overheard talk of selling the property. She listened without interruption, taking notes on a yellow legal pad. Then she looked up and said something that changed everything. "Did you know that the deed you signed includes a clause that still lists you as a joint owner through a life estate?" I blinked. "A what?" She explained that while I had signed the property over, the specific version of the deed maintained my legal right to occupy the property, or a share of it, until my death. That right had financial value. In some cases, I could even claim a portion of the proceeds if the house was sold. My heart pounded in my chest. For the first time in months, I felt like I was waking up from something. "Can I sell my interest?" I asked. She nodded. "Potentially. Or you could challenge any attempt to sell without your consent. Either way, they can't just push you out, not legally." I left her office with a folder full of documents and a quiet, simmering sense of clarity. They thought I was weak, disposable. They saw me as a burden to be managed, not a man to be respected. They thought they could tuck me away in a shed and pretend I was no longer part of the picture. But I was part of it. Legally, financially, historically, that house wouldn't exist without me. And now I had a foothold, a way back into the narrative. As I rode the bus back to their neighborhood, I looked out the window and watched the streets pass like old photographs. I wasn't sure what I would do yet, but I knew one thing. I wasn't going to let them bury me while I was still breathing. They had started something, and I would finish it. I didn't say anything the first few days after visiting the lawyer. I carried the folder back to the shed like it was a holy relic, tucked it beneath the blankets on my cot, and every night I reread the documents by flashlight, mouthing the words silently, as if they might vanish the moment I looked away. I wanted to be sure I understood it right, that I wasn't misreading some legal sleight of hand. But the truth was there, in black and white. I still had rights. And more than that, I had leverage. A part of me wanted to walk straight into the house, hold the folder high, and demand an explanation. But I didn't. Not yet. I wasn't interested in a confrontation I wasn't prepared for. I needed time, and I needed clarity. I needed to see what they were capable of. So I waited. I listened. I took note of every conversation, every glance, every door that was closed too quickly, or every moment when Clayton paused mid-sentence when I entered the room, and Janine suddenly busied herself with the dishes when I stood behind her. I started to sense that my presence, even in silence, unsettled them. That, in itself, became a kind of power. One evening, I was sitting at the edge of the backyard, near the bird bath I had installed decades earlier when the property still belonged to me. I liked to sit there because it was quiet, and I could hear the wind moving through the dry grass in the fields beyond the fence. Clayton came out with a beer in hand and sat on the porch steps, watching me with that uncomfortable half-smile he wore whenever he didn't know how to talk to me. After a few minutes, he said, "Dad, we're going to have an appraiser come by on Thursday. It's just a preliminary thing. Don't worry about it." I nodded slowly. "Are you selling the house?" I asked, even though I already knew the answer. He looked startled, as if he hadn't expected me to speak at all. "No," he said too quickly. "We're just getting a feel for the market. You know, just in case. It's good to be prepared." I said nothing, just kept watching the wind shift the branches in the apple tree Nancy had planted the year Eli was born. Clayton fidgeted. "It doesn't mean anything. It's just, things are tight right now. We've got Eli's tuition coming up, and the mortgage is killing us. You know how it is." I nodded again, and he relaxed, misreading my silence as submission. Thursday came. The appraiser arrived in a black sedan, a young man in a polo shirt and khakis, who walked the perimeter of the house taking photos, scribbling notes into a tablet, occasionally glancing at me with that same patronizing look I'd grown used to, that look people reserve for the elderly, the one that says, "Do you even understand what's happening?" I didn't greet him. I didn't move from my chair by the bird bath. I wanted him to see me. I wanted him to have to work around me, to know that I was part of the landscape, not some forgotten shrub to be trimmed away in post-production. Later that night, Janine approached me in the shed, something she almost never did. She brought a plate of leftovers and set it down on the nightstand like she was delivering rations. "You've been quiet lately," she said, trying to sound casual. "Is everything okay?" I looked up at her, noting the tightness around her eyes, the slight tremor in her fingers as she placed the fork next to the plate. "Fine," I said. "Just thinking." She forced a laugh. "That sounds dangerous." I didn't smile. She waited, but I didn't elaborate. Eventually she retreated. I didn't touch the food. 2 days later, Eli came home from college for the weekend. I hadn't seen him in months. He'd grown taller, leaner, his voice deeper. But he barely looked at me. When I tried to ask him about school, he gave one-word answers. When I asked if he still played the guitar, he said, "Not really," and disappeared into his room. That evening I overheard him talking to Janine in the kitchen. "Why is he still here?" he asked, not bothering to lower his voice. "It's weird. My friends ask why my grandpa lives in a shed." Janine muttered something I couldn't catch, but it didn't matter. I'd heard enough. I sat in the dark, staring at the thin plywood walls, the grain of the wood catching the glow of the heater. I remembered when Eli was 5 and would climb onto my lap to watch old westerns, asking me if I'd ever ridden a horse. I had. I told him once about a summer job on a ranch when I was 16. He'd looked at me like I was a superhero. Now I was just something to be explained away. The next morning, I walked into the kitchen uninvited. Janine was at the counter, sipping coffee, scrolling her phone. She looked up, startled. "Morning," I said. "Do you have a minute?" She set her phone down slowly. "Of course." I pulled out the folder from the lawyer's office and laid it on the table. "I'd like to go over some documents with you and Clayton. It's about the house." She didn't open it. She stared at it like it was a snake coiled to strike. "I thought we already discussed everything." I shook my head. "You discussed it." I nodded. "That's not the same." She hesitated, then said, "Clayton's not home right now. Maybe wait until—" "It doesn't matter." I interrupted. "You can tell him. You're better at making decisions anyway." She didn't respond. I turned and left the house. That night, Clayton came out to the shed, visibly agitated. "What's this about legal documents? Why are you going to lawyers behind our backs?" I met his eyes. "Because I needed to know what I gave up, and what I didn't. I still have rights, Clayton, and I won't be pushed aside." He scoffed. "No one's pushing you aside. We're trying to help you. You're not well, Dad. You forget things. You fall. I fell once," I said sharply, "and I've forgotten fewer things than you think. I remember, for example, when you were 6 and broke your arm falling out of that oak tree in the front yard. You cried all the way to the hospital. I held your hand the whole time. You begged me not to let go." He looked away. "That's not the point." "No," I said quietly, "but it is the context." He left in a huff. The next morning, the lock on the shed door had been changed. I found out when I came back from my walk and couldn't get in. I knocked on the back door until Janine answered. "Clayton thought it would be safer," she said with a thin smile. "We'll give you a key, eventually." I didn't reply. I turned around and walked to the front of the house, sat on the curb, and waited for the mailman. I needed to send a certified letter. I needed the next move to be mine. The weeks that followed were a tense, grueling blur, filled with small victories and mounting frustrations that gnawed away at my resolve like a rat at a loose thread on an old sweater. My letter had gone unanswered, but the act of sending it gave me a strange sense of control, a whisper of power in the midst of feeling so invisible. I spent my days pacing the shed's limited floor space, poring over legal documents Cynthia had sent me, trying to absorb every word and every clause. I knew the fight ahead would be long, and the opposition formidable, but something deep inside had rekindled, an ember that refused to be extinguished by cold shoulders and slammed doors. I wasn't just fighting for a house anymore. I was fighting for my dignity, for the memory of a life that refused to be erased by neglect. One afternoon, I was startled by the sound of voices raised in anger from the backyard. I peeked through the narrow window and saw Clayton and Janine arguing fiercely, their faces flushed with frustration. Clayton held a thick envelope, official-looking, marked with the seal of a local government office. Janine's voice was sharp, dripping with disbelief. "They can't be serious. This is extortion!" She spat. Clayton clenched his jaw. "It's not just that. The county's flagged the property. They're investigating us for potential misuse of the funds connected to the mortgage. This could ruin us." I sat back heavily, the weight of their words settling like a stone in my chest. For a moment, I felt a flicker of satisfaction. Their troubles were now mine, and mine theirs. We were bound together in this messy tangle, whether we liked it or not. Days later, a letter arrived addressed to me, bearing the official insignia of the county assessor's office. My hands trembled as I opened it, revealing a notice of an impending property evaluation and a warning about unresolved financial obligations linked to the house. It was clear now. They had tried to shield their ownership under layers of paperwork, but their house of cards was starting to wobble. With Cynthia's help, I began to draft responses, challenge questionable charges, and gather evidence that the property was, in fact, under joint ownership, and that any attempt to push me out would be met with fierce resistance. The small community centre where Cynthia held free legal workshops became my sanctuary, a place where I was no longer just an old man in a shed, but a person fighting back against injustice. One evening, as I was preparing to leave after a session, Cynthia pulled me aside with a grave look. "Grayson, I've reviewed the financials you brought me, and it's worse than we thought. Clayton and Janine may have been mismanaging funds for years. This isn't just about family disagreements anymore. It could be criminal." I felt my stomach twist. I had always wanted to believe my son was a good man, but the evidence was piling up like storm clouds on the horizon. I wondered if Nancy had seen this coming, if she had worried quietly behind her gentle smiles. My heart ached with the weight of that thought. Around that same time, I found an unlikely ally in Mrs. Keller, my neighbour across the street. She was a sprightly woman in her 70s, sharp-tongued, but with a heart that showed in quiet gestures. A cup of tea left on my doorstep, a note to check on me when I missed my morning walks. One afternoon, she knocked on the shed door, carrying a basket of fresh-baked cookies. "Grayson, I've seen too much to stay quiet," she said. "I know what Clayton and Janine are up to, and I want to help." She had witnessed secret meetings, overheard hushed phone calls about selling fast and avoiding taxes. Her testimony would later become crucial, but for now it was a balm to my bruised spirit to know I was not alone. The turning point came when I discovered an email thread between Clayton and a real estate agent that confirmed their plan to list the property for sale without my consent. The realization was like a punch to the gut. They were trying to cut me out, erase me from the place that was as much mine as theirs. I printed the emails and brought them to Cynthia. She nodded solemnly. "This is concrete proof. We can use this in court." I felt a strange mixture of triumph and sorrow. Triumph because I finally held undeniable evidence. Sorrow because it confirmed the depth of betrayal. One chilly evening, as I sat alone on the porch swing of the shed, I stared up at the starless sky and thought about all the years I had poured into this family. I thought of Nancy's warm hands, the laughter of Eli and Katie when they were small, the Christmas mornings filled with hope. Now all of that felt like a distant echo, drowned out by the cold reality of broken promises and quiet betrayals. Yet beneath it all, a stubborn flame burned inside me, a refusal to be discarded, a will to reclaim my place. The fight was far from over, but I was ready. I would not be silenced. I would not be forgotten. The quiet hostility that had once hung like a fog around the house turned sharp after I submitted the evidence. It was no longer passive neglect or the condescending dismissals of an old man's complaints. It became tension thick enough to taste. Clayton stopped making eye contact altogether. Janine, who had once at least pretended to smile, now avoided me completely, moving past me as though I were a ghost she refused to acknowledge. The children barely came outside. The only sounds that accompanied my days were the hum of the space heater in the shed and the occasional shrill ring of Janine's phone calls that often ended with slammed doors and muttered curses. At night, the lights in the house stayed on later than usual, shadows moving behind drawn curtains, whispers leaking through cracked windows like stray smoke, panic, calculation, strategy. I could sense it. They were preparing for something. Then the letter came. Delivered by courier, thick cream-colored envelope, formal letterhead. An attorney representing Clayton and Janine. It claimed that I was no longer mentally competent, that I was endangering myself by remaining in substandard living conditions, that they were petitioning for guardianship over me for my own safety. I read the letter 3 times before my hand stopped shaking enough to hold the paper still. They were trying to declare me incompetent, strip me of my rights, my voice, my property. It wasn't just about money anymore, it was about erasure, about control. They wanted to legally make me a dependent, a burden they could warehouse. It was an attack not just on my autonomy, but on the very idea that I mattered. I took the letter to Cynthia. She read it slowly, jaw tightening with each line. When she finished, she looked up with a fury I hadn't seen in her before. "This is disgusting," she said. "They're trying to weaponize your age and your isolation, but we're not going to let that happen." She immediately contacted a psychiatrist, a neurologist, and a gerontologist she trusted. 3 separate evaluations to establish my mental and cognitive health. I submitted to each test with stoic determination, answering every question with clarity, describing world events, reciting names and dates, solving arithmetic problems in my head. One doctor asked me to recall 3 objects after a short delay. I listed them, and then added, "And your license plate number is 3UF 726. He looked startled, then smiled. The reports came back clean. "You are fully competent." They read, "No signs of cognitive decline." We filed them with the court as a counter to the guardianship petition. It would delay any actions Clayton and Janine had planned, buying us time. But time, I soon realized, was a double-edged sword, because during those days of legal wrangling and tense silence, something shifted again, not just in the way they treated me, but in the lengths they were willing to go. One afternoon I returned from a doctor's appointment to find the shed door open. I had locked it before leaving. My small box of photographs had been overturned. Nancy's framed picture was face down, the glass cracked. My paperwork folder was missing. I ran to the house, knocked hard. Clayton opened the door, blank-faced. "Did you go into my shed?" I asked. "What?" he said, feigning confusion. "Your shed." "Don't lie to me," I said, louder now. "Where's my paperwork?" "I don't know what you're talking about, Dad. Maybe you misplaced it." I stared at him, his carefully composed face, and for the first time I saw him not as my son, but as something else, someone who had crossed a line he would never return from. I called Cynthia in a panic. She told me to come in immediately. I brought everything I could salvage and spent the afternoon scanning every remaining document, backing it up onto flash drives and encrypted cloud folders. Cynthia handed me a replacement copy of every legal file. We'll assume they'll try this again, she said. From now on, keep your originals off-site. I'll hold duplicates in my office. If anything happens, we'll have a paper trail. It was around that time that the bank called. A transfer had been attempted, $25,000 from an old joint account I had opened with Clayton when he was in college. I'd forgotten it existed. Apparently, he hadn't. The bank flagged the transaction due to an unusual request to transfer on death beneficiaries being changed without my consent. I rushed to the branch, confirmed my identity, and blocked all account access. The teller, a kind woman in her 50s, leaned in and whispered, "You're not the first parent this has happened to." Her words echoed in my mind for days. The next morning, the sheriff came by. A wellness check. "We received a call from your son. Said you'd been confused, hadn't been seen in days." I invited the deputy into the shed, showed him my IDs, the clean doctor reports, the neatly organized space. He nodded sympathetically. "We get these calls a lot." "You seem fine, Mr. McQuaid. Sorry to bother you." He paused at the door. "But be careful. These things sometimes get ugly." Ugly was an understatement. That week, Clayton filed an injunction to freeze all activity on the property. No sales, no access changes, nothing without court oversight. It was a delay tactic, meant to wear me down. Cynthia pushed back with a counter-motion, demanding a court date. She brought the full binder of documentation. "We need to show the judge you are not just competent, you're being targeted." I asked her if it would work. She looked at me, her face both firm and tired. "It has to." One evening, a realtor called me directly, a woman named Deirdre. "Mr. McQuaid, I was told you were interested in selling your portion of the house." I wanted to confirm the listing status. I was stunned. I hadn't contacted her. I asked who gave her my number. She hesitated. "Your son said you were having difficulty managing communications, that I should go through him. But legally, you're on the deed." I told her to cancel everything and send me the paperwork. I cross-checked her name against emails I found in the trash folder of Clayton's old laptop, which he had mistakenly left in the shed during one of their staged clean-outs. He'd been posing as me, using a separate email address, fabricating conversations with agents, and even signing my name on initial sale interest forms. I printed every page. Cynthia was livid. "This is forgery," she said. "We'll include it in the upcoming motion." But the most painful blow came not from a stranger, not from a document or a lawyer's letter. It came from Eli. He came into the shed one afternoon, alone, his face drawn with tension. "Grandpa," he said quietly, "why are you doing this?" I asked what he meant. "Why are you fighting Mom and Dad? They're just trying to help you. They said you don't know what's going on anymore, that you get confused, that you're hoarding money and hurting the family." I couldn't breathe for a second. My grandson, my blood, looked at me, not with concern but with suspicion. I told him everything. I showed him the documents, the court filings, the forged emails. He looked at them, nodded, but his face didn't change. "I don't know," he said softly. "I just think maybe it'd be easier if you let them handle it." I said nothing. He left. I didn't see him again for weeks. The day of the court hearing arrived. I wore the suit Nancy had tailored for me the year we renewed our vows. It hung loose on me now, my frame thinner, my posture more stooped. But I stood tall. Cynthia spoke calmly and powerfully, presenting each piece of evidence. The judge, a silver-haired woman with keen eyes, listened without expression. Clayton and Janine sat 2 rows behind us, whispering to their attorney. When the judge asked if I wished to speak, I stood and said only this: "I may be old, but I am not gone. I built the life they're now trying to sell from under me. I ask only to be treated like a man, not a piece of property." There was silence in the courtroom. The judge ruled that the guardianship petition was without merit and was dismissed with prejudice. The freeze on the property was lifted. I walked out of that courthouse into the bright afternoon light and felt, for the first time in months, like the ground beneath me belonged to me again. But the fight was far from over. Now that they knew I wouldn't go quietly, I expected retaliation, and I was right. The very next day, I received a letter from the Homeowners Association, anonymous complaints about noise, about property condition, about unauthorized occupation of outbuildings. I knew who had filed them. The same day, I received a visit from Child Protective Services. We received a tip that children might be endangered on the property. I stood there in stunned silence. "There are no children?" I said. The agent nodded. "That's what we figured. Sorry to trouble you." Cynthia began filing formal complaints of harassment, but the damage was psychological. I started sleeping less. Every car that slowed near the driveway made my stomach knot. Every envelope in the mailbox made my hands tremble. And yet, I did not retreat. I met with the new realtor, Veronica, began the process of assessing the house value, and initiated the steps to force a sale through the courts. They thought they could outweight me, but they underestimated just how much time a man has when he's been abandoned. I had nothing but time, and now I had a purpose, and I was just getting started. I woke up on the morning of the final court hearing to an eerie kind of stillness, the kind that seems too quiet to be natural, as if the world itself were holding its breath. I sat on the edge of the cot in the shed, my hands clasped tightly, my thoughts drifting between memories and strategy. I thought of Nancy's laugh, how it used to fill the house, bouncing off the kitchen tiles like a melody only I was meant to hear. I thought of Clayton as a boy, how he used to fall asleep with his head in my lap during thunderstorms, trusting that I could protect him from everything, even the sky. And now here we were, at war over bricks and blood, names on deeds, digits in accounts, as if all the real things had been lost along the way. The judge was scheduled to rule on the petition to force the sale of the house. We had submitted everything. Proof of my co-ownership, the fraudulent attempts to erase me from communications with realtors, the forged documents, the manipulation of joint accounts, and the failed guardianship attempt. Veronica had also found a serious buyer, someone willing to offer a full market price with cash, contingent only on unanimous consent or a court order. Cynthia was confident. "We've done everything right," she said. "They've run out of places to hide." I nodded, not because I was certain, but because I didn't want to let fear show anymore. I chose not to attend court that day. I had already stood in that room, already shown the court my face and my clarity. Let the paperwork and facts do the rest. Instead, I sat at a small cafe downtown, the same one where Nancy and I used to come after Sunday service. The waitress was new, didn't know me, but still poured my coffee with a smile and called me Sir. And for a few quiet minutes, I let myself feel normal again. I had just taken a sip when my phone rang. Cynthia's name flashed on the screen. I answered with trembling hands. "It's done," she said, her voice light with relief. "The judge approved the forced sale. You're entitled to a third of the proceeds. They have 30 days to vacate the house." I exhaled slowly. "How did they react?" I asked. "About how you'd expect. Outrage, threats, a last-minute plea to delay enforcement. But the judge didn't waver. They're out of legal moves, Grayson. This is over." But it wasn't over. Not in the way she meant. The next afternoon, as I was walking back from the pharmacy, a black SUV pulled up beside me with a screech. The passenger door flung open, and out stepped Clayton, face pale, eyes bloodshot, tie loose around his neck. Janine followed, her hair frizzy, makeup smudged, hands trembling as she gripped her phone like a weapon. Clayton got in my face, his voice a strangled hiss. You're destroying our lives. Do you even understand what you've done?" I didn't flinch. I looked at him like I might look at a stranger shouting in the street. Something distant and detached, once familiar, but now unrecognizable. "You destroyed your own life, son," I said, my voice quiet but firm. "I just stopped helping you hide it." Janine stepped forward, her voice higher pitched, more frantic. "We took care of you. You lived in our backyard for free. We fed you, cleaned up after you, and this is how you repay us." I laughed then, not out of amusement, but because the sheer absurdity of it cracked something inside me. "You put me in a shed," I said. "You treated me like a stray animal. You stole from me, tried to erase me. And now you're shocked that I stood up for myself?" They fell silent. For a moment, Clayton's face softened, not with remorse, but with weariness. "You should have just let it go," he said. "We could have kept things quiet." I stepped back, raised my hand to stop the conversation. "I'm done," I said. "You have 30 days to leave that house. After that, I don't care where you go." Janine's voice cracked as she whispered, "You'll die alone." I shrugged. "We all do. But at least I'll die free." They didn't try to contact me again. The days that followed were filled with logistics, paperwork, bank transactions, property inspections. Veronica managed the closing with efficiency that bordered on surgical. The house sold for just over $700,000. My share came out to nearly $235,000. I transferred it to a separate account, one that only I had access to, under a new mailing address. I used part of it to pay Cynthia and Veronica generously, sending them handwritten thank you cards along with their checks. The rest I kept quiet, untouched, like a final insurance policy. I moved into a new apartment across town, small, clean, modern, with a view of a lake that reminded me of summers long ago in the Sierras. The neighbors were kind, mostly retirees like me, people who smiled without pretense. I bought new furniture, simple and comfortable. I hung up the photo of Nancy by the window, where the light caught her smile every morning. I heard through Mrs. Keller, who still kept in touch, that Clayton and Janine had moved into a rental, smaller than their old place, in a neighborhood not nearly as polished. Eli had gone back to school, quiet and withdrawn. Katie hadn't come home for summer. There were rumors about financial strain, about declined loans, about social services inquiring after certain reports. I didn't ask for details. I didn't want revenge. I had already gotten something more powerful, clarity, a sense that I had reclaimed my name, my presence, my right to stand on my own 2 feet. But the moment that made everything real came 2 weeks after the house sale, when I received a small package in the mail. No return address. Inside was an envelope, and inside that a handwritten note. It was from Eli. "Grandpa," it began, "I don't know who to believe anymore, but I've been thinking a lot about everything you said, and I'm sorry. I should have listened better. I hope you're okay. Maybe one day we can talk." No signature, no number, just that quiet olive branch, extended without expectation. I sat with that letter in my hands for a long time, staring at his handwriting, wondering how much pain a family has to endure before it finds its way back to truth. I folded the letter gently and placed it inside my desk drawer, next to my war medals and Nancy's locket. It wasn't forgiveness. Not yet. But it was something close. And for now, that was enough. The mornings in my new place begin slowly now, with the soft shuffle of slippers against hardwood floors and the gentle bubbling of the coffee pot that fills the kitchen with a warmth the shed never knew. The lake outside glistens faintly through the window, the water unmoved by wind, untouched by memory. I wake without an alarm. I no longer live by anyone else's schedule. There is no door to knock on, no waiting for permission to enter, No sideways glances across dinner tables, no carefully concealed scowls behind polite tones. My world has shrunk, yes, but in the best way possible. It has become mine again. Every inch of this apartment was chosen, arranged, paid for by me, not borrowed or tolerated, not offered as a favor under false pretenses. The freedom is simple, clean, and sharp. I find that I no longer dread silence. It used to feel like abandonment. Now it feels like peace. I speak to Nancy in the mornings sometimes, quietly, not expecting an answer. Just a word or two as I pass her photo. I think she would have liked this place. The view, the quiet, the fact that there's a second bedroom just in case. I don't expect guests, but I keep the bed made anyway. Some habits die slower than others. It took a while for my hands to stop shaking when the mail arrived. For weeks after the court ruling, I braced for retaliation every time I heard the thump of envelopes against the floor. But they stopped coming. No more fake complaints, no more legal threats, no more offers disguised as olive branches. Clayton and Janine disappeared into their own fallout. Their silence was not peace, but it was distance, and distance was enough. I heard from Mrs. Keller again last week. She told me they had defaulted on a loan and were considering bankruptcy. I thanked her and asked her not to bring them up again. That part of the story is closed. I have no appetite for their suffering. Justice, once served, should not be relived like a meal reheated too many times. Some endings are best left still. The apartment complex hosts a monthly potluck, mostly retirees with stories to tell and time to tell them. At first, I hesitated to attend. I thought I had nothing left to share, that the rust in my voice would mark me as damaged goods. But I went, and I brought a peach cobbler from a recipe Nancy had scribbled on an old note card. It disappeared quickly. A woman named Loretta asked if I played cribbage. A man named Harold said he used to be in the Navy and asked if I ever served. I nodded and told him I had once upon a time, and for the first time in what felt like years, I told my story without bitterness. Not the story of the shed or the court or the betrayal, but the earlier one. The story of a boy who built a family, who fell in love, who raised a son and paid his bills and fought in a war and grew tomatoes in the backyard. It felt good to be heard, not as a plaintiff or a problem, but as a person. Last night I sat on my small balcony with a glass of brandy and reread Eli's letter. I still don't know what I'll do about it. I haven't written back. I might never. Or maybe I will, one day, when the soil feels soft enough for something new to grow. I know that damage leaves roots deeper than anyone likes to admit, and that love, real love, needs more than time. It needs truth. I'm not angry anymore, not really. What I am is awake, present, a man in full possession of his days. I make my own breakfast, I set my own bedtime, I open the blinds when I want to see the light and close them when I don't. And sometimes, when the wind is quiet and the light bends just right through the glass, I swear I can hear Nancy laugh. It's not memory exactly. It's something closer, a reminder that I lived, that I still do.